This morning some news came out about Target, which really hurt the stock price for Target, but is really one of the best things that can happen for inflation. Now, the reason we're talking about Target, and we're about to get into the article real quick, is because Target and Walmart are some of the biggest retailers that we have in the United States. In the United States, we have about 8.3% inflation, and that's just the reported number on the CPI. It's probably in the double digits, much more larger than that. Inflation is pretty bad. In order for the economy to get back on the right track, meaning stocks to go up and for us to get back into a bull market, which is going to take presumably some time, potentially 10 to 18, 24 months. We don't know how long it's going to take, but in order for us to get out of the bear market that we are in, when I mean bear market, I mean most growth stocks down almost 70, 80% from their all-time highs in 2021, is we need to get rid of inflation. Why do we need to get rid of inflation? Because if we can reduce inflation, the Fed doesn't have to increase interest rates to astronomical levels. Increased interest rates are bad because the cost of borrowing capital increases because you are paying more in interest for borrowing money, which means the future cash flows for companies also are more expensive to generate because you have to spend more money to borrow the capital to be able to generate the additional cash flows, which means valuations for companies become compressed. And this is what has happened to most growth stocks, whether it's the Palantirs of the world, the Teslas of the world, the SoFis, Robinhoods, etc. All of the anything in the ARK Innovation Fund, all of these stocks have been hurt by rising interest rates, more inflation. More inflation is also bad for consumers because it is essentially an artificial tax by decreasing the purchasing power of your dollar. If you make $10 per hour and now the cost of milk increases by 20% and you don't get an increase in your wage, then you have effectively lost 20% of your purchasing power with your money, which is really tough for people who are not making that much money, who are living paycheck to paycheck, or even are doing like median average salaries that are above normal, but it still is bad because they're not, the most risk people in the world. That extra 20% does hurt them. So we got to reduce inflation. Well, how do we reduce inflation? One way to reduce inflation is if we can have more supply of goods, which means there is less competition, or there's more competition for pricing around that supply. And if we have less demand for that supply, in that case, prices go down. If I have 10 TVs and a million people want all those 10 of those TVs, there's a lot of demand from those million people for the 10 TVs, and therefore the 10 TVs with a limited supply, because there's only 10 of them, forces prices to go up. If I have a million TVs and only 10 people want them, well, there's really less demand and there's only a million TVs, which means that there's enough supply, which means the prices have to go down in order to accommodate that demand. Target expects squeezed profits from aggressive plan to get rid of unwanted warranty. This is the news that comes today. It sent the stock price down another 7%. It was already down another 12% 2 weeks ago based on a not good earnings. It is bad for the retailer short term, but it's good for inflation long term. Target said it will take a short-term hit to profits as it cancels orders and marks down unwanted merchandise. CEO Brian Cornell said the big box retailer wants to clear room for the merchandise, including groceries and back-to-back school supplies. Obviously, they're getting ready for September, even though we're just getting into the summer, but they have to think a couple months ahead. Target anticipates its operating margin rate for the second quarter will be around 2%. That's lower than the outlook it gave less than 3 weeks ago when they reported earnings. And the company also reiterated its forecast for sales growth and said margins will look healthier in the back half of the year. Basically what they're saying is we have too much inventory, no one's buying it, which means consumer demand is going down, inventories are going up, supply chains are getting better because we have enough stuff in stock. It's not moving off the shelves, which is a good thing. In the macro for inflation, it's a bad thing for Target because they can't sell their product, but that means that there's less demand for products. There's more products in general, which means inflation theoretically should be going down from this. So CEO says, we thought it was prudent for us to be decisive, act quickly and get in front of this, address and optimize our inventory in the second quarter, take those actions necessary to remove the excess inventory and get ourselves to continue to be the guest relevant with our assortment. By taking swift action, Cornell said Target can fend off further pain and make room for merchandise that customers do want, such as groceries, beauty items, household essentials, and seasonal categories like back to school supplies. He said the company stores and website are seeing strong traffic and a very resilient customer, but one who no longer shops popular COVID pandemic categories, meaning people are still buying. They're just not buying at the levels that, people are not buying crazy amounts of laptops anymore because they know they'll be able to get a laptop in the future because they're not afraid of supply chain concerns from chips in China and Taiwan and Japan because they know that they're in supply, right? There's not that much of a shortage of supply. We want to make sure that we continue to lean into those categories that are relevant today, he said. Now, Target anticipates its operating margin rate for the second quarter will be around 2%. They said it would be about 5.3%, so that's lower than the outlook they gave. And then retailers from Walmart and Gap to face a glut of inventory as inflation-pinched sloppers skip over categories that were popular during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Gap, for instance, said customers want party dresses and office clothes instead of the many fleece hoodies and active clothes the company has. Fleece hoodies and active clothes, why were those bought during the pandemic? I'm not necessarily sure, but nonetheless, people don't want them anymore. Walmart said some families are making fewer discretionary purchases as the prices of gas and groceries rise. This is a big thing as gas and groceries become more expensive because of inflation. People are buying less, water bottles that you don't really need. You could just drink water out of a glass. So it's like a discretionary purchase that you don't need, which means Walmart's going to have a lot more water bottles that they have to sell. Abercrombie & Fitch and American Eagle Outfitters both reported a steep jump in inventory levels, up 46 and 45% respectively from a year ago, from a mix of items not selling and supply chain delays easing, meaning their supply chains are getting better. These are clothing stores, American Eagle and Abercrombie & Fitch, and less people are actually buying the actual clothes. The extreme shift in consumer spending habits comes as retailers start to get back to healthy in-stock levels, meaning there's a good amount of supply that they have. That means some of an abundance of sweatpants, throw pillows, and pajamas just as consumers search for swimsuits and suitcases. Plus, some shoppers are trimming back on spending due to inflation or putting more of their dollars towards experiences like dining out and traveling. Let's go to Target's stock, and we'll kind of show the action. I think it recovered a little bit this morning based upon what we saw. So let's go to Target right now. Yeah, it recovered a little bit. So 155. It was about 145 this morning, as you can see in pre-market. It hit that. I think even in market open, it hit that. And then 155. It's down 2.9%. So the big drop for Target. Let's go to the 6 months. Big drop was here. Target was at 254 in April 20. April 20th, 254. Wow. That was a big drop. I didn't even know it was that high in April 20th. Okay, so it was at 254, and it came down to about 215. And then since then, that was the big crash right here. It came down to about 150-ish range from April to March. So from April to March, if you look at the full year, let's look at the 1-year chart on this. So it was 265 back in November 2021. 250 April 2022, so not that big of a decline from that. I mean, it went pretty down to the 180s, but it recovered very nicely. And then boom, that bad earnings report they gave a while back, it shot it down to the 160s. And now it's at 145. So ultimately, what does this mean for Target? Number one, I think Target will recover for this. And I think ultimately Target knows this is a good thing. It sucks for their profits and their operating margins, but they understand that excess inflation and excess consumer demand is going to be good for no one in the long term. They're not going to build a healthy, sustainable, profitable business if they assume that the pandemic-style trends of the past 2 years were going to continue into the future that led to the supply chain shortages and led to rising inflation costs. So what does Target need to do? Target needs to act swiftly like they've done. They're going to take a short-term hit on the stock price, but eventually I think companies like Target, Walmart, they're going to be fine, primarily because you need to get inflation under control in order for those businesses to be in business. There needs to be eases in supply chain and a steady flow of supply and demand in order for those businesses to be reasonable. If there's way too much demand for their supply, they are constantly out of stock. And if there's way too much supply and not enough demand because inflation overinflates the prices, which means people don't want to buy TVs anymore or water bottles, they're only buying groceries and gas, then that's also bad for those businesses. So long term, this is good from a macroeconomic perspective for inflation. Now, Target and Walmart are really important because if these companies are suffering from this stuff, then more companies that are retailers that are not as big as Target and Walmart are also going to be suffering from this stuff as well. So that's sort of the important thing I think to think about when it comes here. Now, someone left a really good comment on my Twitter when I tweeted about this, and I want to show you real quick to give you the other side of this perspective. So they said, and I'll show them here, Abal Amos, he said, I said bad short-term for Target, but great for reducing inflation. He says, not really. Excess inventory is a symptom of oil shock. Real consumption will keep falling to accommodate rising energy spends within a fixed household budget. And I said, inflation is not solved, but at least this is decent. And he says, the source of ongoing future inflation is likely disappearance of Russian oil and how Russia will retaliate as its foreign inflows from energy fully dry up. And Russian oil won't get replaced because oil companies and refiners have little incentive to invest further in a future ESG world. So I think the argument he's bringing up is really interesting to kind of talk about it here. His argument is excess inventory is a symptom of oil shock, which means the oil shock prices we're having is leading to the excess inventory. That is true. I don't think that's fully like 1000% true. I think another argument is just like lack of consumer demand, right? People just don't want to buy that stuff, and supply chains are getting better. China's opening up for the first time in the past couple months. So I think there's a ton of different ways to evaluate why inventories are increasing. And to Ark's credit and to Kathy's credit, she's been calling on this for a while now. She's been late on this by about 6, 7, 8 months, but she's been calling on the fact that inventories will get back to normal, and that means we don't have to increase interest rates by that much. So the key here is that even though inventories are increasing, the argument that Abel is making here about oil is that this is still going to hurt inflation, because if the global economy doesn't have the third biggest producer of oil creating oil and pumping it into the global supply of oil, then that means oil prices are going to be inflated. If the Saudis don't help us, if Iran doesn't help us, if all these other countries don't help us, and we have to produce our own oil, which takes years to make the refineries to actually be able to drill the oil. Like, oil prices are going to go up, and if oil prices go up, it controls the internal link to all the other types of prices going up. Because if oil prices go up, then that means the cost of producing things from a supply chains perspective, raw materials perspective, also goes up. Like, oil prices hurts everything. Forget just transportation; it affects every part of the supply chain. So inflation is still going to be pretty bad, and we're not going to see a totally dramatic reduction, even though inventories are increasing, unless we deal with this oil problem as well. And so it's going to be an interesting thing to see that even if inventories are increasing and consumer demand is going down, how are oil prices going to affect the end consumer, and how are they going to affect the global supply chain when it comes to the prices of actual goods and services that we use every day? So those are my thoughts, those are my comments. Let me know what you guys think about oil prices and supply chain shocks and Target and their inventories, and if that's going to help inflation. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to reading the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.